Welcome back to Open Line. We are talking about a new book out, and we have the author with us. The book is A Murder in Music City. The author is Michael Bishop. He spent really a couple decades investigating an old murder in Nashville, a very notorious murder, 1964 murder of Paula Herring. She was 18 years old. She was babysitting her brother. And as we went to break, I said, when you started looking into this, you found this file, and you began to look into this. You thought there were questions that really kind of haunted you, that really stood out. Two questions maybe that weren't fully explored on the weekend she was found dead.
And the questions turned out to be, one came from Paula's little brother, and I spoke with him probably within 30 days of discovering this file in the Metro Archives. And the questions were, why didn't the man who was convicted, John Randolph Clark, why didn't he kill me on the same night that he killed my sister? So it's a pretty haunting question that you're going to carry probably the rest of your days. And the second question, I didn't understand at the time, but the second question was, whatever happened to my father's suicide note? So it turned out when Paula Herring was coming back to Nashville for that weekend to see her little brother and her mother, her father had been found dead in the Knoll Hotel in 1960, in September in Nashville. Questionable circumstances, other than the fact that the medical examiners said that Paula's father had been drinking rat poison, that he had ingested a bottle of arsenic and took his own life, a suicide. So those two questions were what Alan Herring had when I asked Alan, what do you remember about the weekend, that night? And he said, lost it, just completely lost it. So those two questions from the little brother, combined with the questions I was finding myself, things like, I later discovered there had not been an autopsy on one of the most notorious murders in Nashville. How did that happen? Just other elements of that. When I went out to find the grave of Paula Herring in Gallatin, Tennessee, I discovered there was a missing headstone. I discovered that not only was there Paula's grave, but right beside her was an empty grave. Two graves had been purchased on the same weekend that Paula had died. So I had plenty of things to occupy my time, and it certainly was a puzzle that I wanted to work.
And so you talked to the brother, who was what, 7 at the time?
Six years old
at the time. He's the only surviving family member.
That is correct.
The mom is dead.
Correct.
The dad, you said, he committed suicide, but
right.
He wondered where the note was. And so there's the brother. What was his reaction when you said, I want to write a book about this, I have questions about the whole thing? And
it was interesting, when I came to him with that first conversation, I told him something that I hadn't even thought about expressing to Alan Herring. But what I told him was, when I was 6 years old myself, living on a farm in North Alabama, we had a family member living with us, an 18-year-old aunt. So one day in the first grade, as I'm 6 years old, I went to school, I came back, the 18-year-old aunt vanished. Never heard from her, never saw her. I mean, that went on for decades. No one would explain what had happened. So when I spoke with Paula's little brother, I just described for him, I think I'm your man to help try to maybe just do some research for you. I'm not a cop, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a paralegal, but I think I can do some research for you. And I couched it in the terms of, not only did I go to the University of Tennessee, 20 years after Paula Herring was there, I feel like maybe I can help a fellow student, but I kind of get that in some small sense. I get that 6-year-old, 18-year-old connection. So Alan's response to me was, he wanted me to help find anything I could find, and I started out sharing.
He didn't mind you looking into it.
Not at all.
He gave you the blessing. Absolutely. From the family to look into this.
Absolutely. And in fact, at one point, I ended up having to write a motion to the Supreme Court to get a hold of some court records, and Alan had to be a part of that process, part of that request as well. So no, we continued conversations for many years. John Randolph Clark is the person who was convicted. Correct. He only spent 9 years in prison. Correct. He always maintained his innocence. Absolutely. Did Alan Herring, did he believe that John Randolph Clark did it? Absolutely. He certainly did. And so did I initially, and then later on. I mean, initially when this murder took place, every cop, every available policeman in the city was assigned to find Paula Herring's killer. And the police initially brought in, I think the first person arrested, or at least hauled in, was a Central State Psychiatric Hospital patient who had wandered off of the grounds. They brought that person in, pretty quickly figured out, no, he's wearing the wrong kind of footwear, so we know where this guy came from. Then they arrested 2 Vanderbilt students on Sunday morning. So the murder took place Saturday night. Sunday morning at daybreak, a couple of fraternity brothers from Vanderbilt University were driving down West End Avenue. One of them decided to fire a pistol out of the car for fun. They'd been having a big party all night. The police arrested both those guys, kept them in. Then there was there was early news that a bloody man had been seen at the Crystal Hamburger restaurant in Nashville, the one in Melrose, still there on Franklin Road. The 4th person that they brought in was John Randolph Clark. And eventually, Clark ended up being the guy who was arrested, indicted. He ended up being convicted later that same year of the crime.
It was a very short trial, 5-day trial, and he was convicted. And he maintained his innocence.
Absolutely. And in fact, on the 5-day trial part of this, what I was completely blown away by, how do you have a trial on what arguably was the most sensational murder at the time in the South? A 5-day trial. When you go back and look at the trial for O.J. Simpson, the criminal trial for the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman, 250 days. Started late January of 95, ran to October 95, 35 weeks. But this trial, the judge got up and said on Monday morning, September 1964, we're going to start today and this trial will be over Friday. That Friday at 5:15 p.m., the verdict came back. Clark was convicted. End of story.
Lancito was not the judge.
No.
Clearly,
No.
Things moved a little more quickly
Yes.
during that trial. So you start looking into this. You talk about a political cover-up. Because the theory, and the person convicted, it was that he knew the mom, I believe, and then was going to go and try and sexually assault the 18-year-old.
Right.
And there was no evidence that he had been in any sort of fight. There wasn't a lot of evidence against him. There was some other stuff that was found, a bullet and those kind of things. But when you say political cover-up, so you're saying the wrong man was convicted and it was intentional.
It was absolutely intentional. What happened, the way Clark ended up being convicted, one of his drinking buddies, and John Randolph Clark probably wasn't maybe not Nashville's finest citizen at the time. He was in and out of employment. His wife, however, was an award-winning school teacher, a biology teacher at Collin High School here in Nashville. But Clark couldn't seem to keep a job forever, and he liked to drink. And he ended up meeting Paula Herring's mother one night at a small a place called Ruth's Diner over on, actually it would have been on West End Avenue in Nashville. And they ended up hooking up for a one-night stand. Clark went out to the house, and eventually what happened is Clark's gun, he carried a .32 caliber pistol with him in a shoulder holster. Clark's gun, combined with some questionable other evidence, ended up being what convicted Clark. But what I discovered after I started going down this particular path is that there were some other people who were involved in what I would describe as it was described to me as a drinking club. The assistant DA, who was a prosecutor for the case, described it as a drinking club, and there were some very powerful members, Metro officials, who were part of this drinking club. And the drinking club included some nurses, included an assistant DA, a district attorney, and some other high-ranking officials in Metro Nashville.
And nurses, why nurses? Why would nurses be, of interest to these very powerful people?
Great question. So what happened is, I don't think I'm going to share new information here. For folks who were living in Nashville at the time, they might have remembered that the first Metro mayor seemed to have his own, I guess I would call them demons in terms of addictions. Alcoholism was a terrible problem for Mayor Beverly Briley. The good news on the positive side for Briley was he was such a visionary. Many people said he could run the city better in whatever state he was in, better than anybody else could do it sober. So Beverly Briley would actually end up occasionally drying out, was the term that was used back then. He'd go to Vanderbilt Hospital to dry out. And some nurses met up with Briley there and some other officials. And they began spending time together, drinking. It wasn't, the kind of thing that would make the news back in the day. Nobody was writing anything about in the newspaper or on television about the personal lives of public officials. Yet people knew, I think, in a large way, what those personal lives were like. So that's how the nurses came to be a part of the story.
They met him there, and they had access to, I guess, medications.
So in 1964, and you're exactly right, in 1964, the way medicines were controlled or kept, a cart, literally a cart, was out in the hallways of all the different rooms. The nurses would come by, grab the medicine that might need to go to a particular, a particular patient. And in some cases, rather than giving the patient the medicine that they needed, they might just pocket that and instead give them aspirin or maybe give them nothing at all. So you had nurses who had their own addiction problems, and they could literally, a few that I talked to, they were walking out of the hospital with a lot of products, a lot of regulated products, some very powerful products.
And so, all right, we have to go to break again, but then to take us up to this point, what you're saying is that Paula Herring was murdered because of what she knew about this social club, about these powerful people, and it wasn't because she was attacked by John Randolph Clark. She knew something.
Yes.
And that's where the political cover-up comes in.
Exactly so.
All right. See, I think that's fascinating. All right, we're going to talk more about that. If you want to call in, there's the number, 615-737-PLUS, 615-737-7587. Take a break. Be back right after this.